This is KHPR, the voice of darkness for the intrepid travelers of the left-hand path. I'm Magister Robert Adams, your host. We'll be accompanying you on your journey. So get ready, sit back, relax, and prepare to Kepher and remanifest. Welcome to KHPR, the voice of darkness. I'm Magister Robert Adams, your host, and today we have with us Magister Doug Pridgen, who is going to be talking about philosophy as an initiatory path. Doug, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, within the Temple of Set, there are different ways that we can find to use to achieve Kepher, which is to come into being, as we've spoken about before. Now, you in particular like to use philosophy. So why don't you give us a little opening statement, basically, regarding philosophy and how you use it within the temple?
Okay, first I'd like to clarify what is commonly taught in universities today as philosophy is different than what I have in mind, and that's largely due to Judeo-Christianity when the southern influence from the Mediterranean came into Western civilization, and was basically, at that time, philosophy was taken over by people like Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, and obviously a lot of other people and monks translating manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle, which is why a lot of that survived. But philosophy originally started as philosophy in 582 BC with a man named Pythagoras, who actually coined the term. And what the word philosophy means is a lover of wisdom. And he used that word because he wanted to distinguish himself from other people who claim to possess wisdom. Now, this is very closely related to our Ionic concept of Runa, which in ancient Greece was called mysterion. And before Pythagoras, there were mystery cults or mystery religions, which were initiatory religions dedicated to particular gods, Dionysus, Apollo, etc. And the one that had the most influence on Pythagoras was the mysteries of Orpheus. And Pythagoras supposedly traveled all over the world and learned initiatory teachings from Egyptians, Babylonians, and even supposedly went up into Northern Europe, and he synthesized all of this into his own particular teaching that was heavily influenced or based upon mathematics. But his view of mathematics was very, not only quantitative, but also very qualitative. The numbers, if you study the writings that have come down to us, which none of his writings have actually survived, the approach they take to number is very much qualitative. That's too much to go into right now, but there's a good book on our reading list by John Anthony West called The Serpent in the Sky.
Yes.
That's a very good overview of that approach to number. And also one attributed to Iamblichus, who was later Neoplatonist. That book is called The Theology of Arithmetic. So what Pythagoras did was, the mystery cults were very much about an experiential approach, a more sensual approach to initiation. And it's an interesting parallel between actually how things were approached during the Age of Satan as opposed to when the Eon of Set came into being. Their approach was much more carnal and sensual, you could say. And then when the Eon of Set came into being, that focus shifted more towards an abstract or intellectual approach. And I think there was a similar thing that happened here with Pythagoras. He took this and internalized it more and systematized it more. But there was also, it was something that was meant to be applied and lived and approached as a lifestyle, whereas today philosophers mostly engage in speculation and theory, and it's all exclusively intellectual, and they tend to, because of that, they tend to get lost in theory and speculation, and eventually it just seems to become increasingly detached from reality and has little practical value to life. I've actually tried to read several more recent philosophical texts, some from German idealists like Kant on up to existentialists, and even more recently deconstructionist and postmodern philosophers. And I don't know if you've ever tried to read any of this stuff, but it's like you have to read a page 4 or 5 times, and then you still don't know whether they're actually talking about something or whether it's just, it's very dense and not very practical or
right. Yeah, and actually, I've run across lots of pseudo-intellectual psychobabble, I like to refer to it, that, it's kind of like just words on paper. And,
right.
How are you really going to use something like that when you can't make sense out of it? And sometimes even the authors can't make sense out of it. So do you have any tricks or techniques for telling when someone is writing from a philosophical standpoint, whether or not you should believe it or whether or not it's bullshit?
Well, there's 2 approaches I take to that. One, if I read something and I don't understand it, and I actually take the time to try to think about it and actually read it several times or study it, and it still doesn't make sense, then either I decide that either it's over my head or it doesn't really mean anything. I'm more interested. I tend to go back to the ancient classical philosophers, the ancient Hellenic and Hellenistic traditions, and this is due to the influence of my teacher, Ipsissimus Stephen Flowers, and I use the Polarian method, a method that he came up with to remanifest the Northern European and runic traditions. I apply that same method to the Hellenic and Hellenistic traditions because, as I said, as this influence from the South, from the Hamitic cultures, kind of came up through Christianity and eventually came to replace and dominate the older Indo-European ways of thinking, philosophies, and religions. A lot of it got buried. It's still there to be discovered because they obviously, well, for one reason, we speak an Indo-European, a Germanic language, English, and a lot of our language does have roots even in Greek. And in fact, almost all of the language used in a lot of academic subjects are Greek, because Greek was basically the English of its time. It was the Koine, or the common, the most universally spoken language at that time, due to, in no small part, to the conquest of Alexander, who also happened to be Aristotle's student. So that's how a lot of this, and then also, as I mentioned, the monks and copying the ancient manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato. So there's a lot to look into, but also you have to look deeper back into the origins, back to Pythagoras and these mystery religions. I think that's why there's a lot of confusion in modern philosophy, because it actually, because of this foreign influence, that's how it got detached from reality. Because, as you know, Christianity and most other forms of monotheism, such as Judaism and Islam, are much more concerned with an afterlife rather than worrying about what happens here on Earth, which explains how philosophy got detached from being applicable to life here on Earth.
Yeah, I can see that. Now, how do you actively use philosophy as an initiatory way of doing your work within the temple, for yourself?
Well, at the beginning, at the first, most basic level of things, philosophy deals with questions that are central to living life as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those central questions being, what is the nature of reality or the universe within which I exist? What is my nature? And what am I to do as a result of that? What is my place in the scheme of things? In other words, and these are the three basic branches of philosophy as outlined by Aristotle: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics deals with the most fundamental ideas about reality and existence. Mm-hmm. Epistemology deals with what is knowledge, how do we achieve knowledge, and how do we know that we've achieved knowledge? In other words, how do we decrease the margin of error in our pursuit of knowledge? And the third question deals with, once those two theoretical branches are sketched out to a certain extent, how then do I go about living my life, which is ethics? In other words, the theoretical, there is no disconnect in real philosophy between theory and practice. Mm-hmm. There's a catchphrase you might have heard. It sounds good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice.
Right.
Well, if it's not a good theory, if it doesn't work in practice, then it's not a good theory, is my approach.
Sure, I can see that.
Yeah, so part of the truth of a theory is whether or not it is applicable or has any effect. And this is where it ties into magic, cause and effect. The natural universe obviously works by cause and effect. It's deterministic. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a brief answer to what is the nature of the universe. Human nature seems to be a little bit different. We also are to a certain extent subject to that type of cause and effect, but because we have consciousness or isolate intelligence, or what we call the gift of Set in the temple, we are also able to conceptualize things in our minds and then come up with a course of action to bring that about in the objective universe. A very simple example that everyone can understand is you conceptualize a building of some sort, let's say a house. You draw a blueprint. You then take materials from the objective universe, raw materials, and shape those using tools to bring that vision into being in the objective universe. Now, in a more abstract sense, that might not be considered magic per se, but it is relevant to what magic is. In magic, you are using what Aristotle called the principle of final causality, which is teleological, which these Ionic words that we have in the temple and that even preceded the temple with people like Crowley and on back to more ancient magicians, these are what are called guiding principles, or they give you an orientation of something to work towards, in the sense of projecting a future course of action and then taking steps needed to bring that about. So, right. So that is a different type of causality than the deterministic causality, and that is why in the Settian philosophy that is seen as non-natural, because it has an impact on and goes against the inertia in the objective universe.
Yeah, and let's talk about subjective and objective universe, because that's going to be coming up a lot in this talk today. And Dr. Aquino talked about it in the interview I did with him, but I've been thinking of ways to even make it seem simpler to people. And to me, let's take as an example a lawn. There's green grass on the lawn. Now, I can look at that lawn and see there's green grass. You can look at the lawn and see that there's green grass. But what you're seeing is green and what I'm seeing is green may not exactly be the same thing, because we're filtering it through our own senses, basically. And we aren't getting the full picture. So that's what subjective universe is. The objective universe is really what it is, that we can't fully perceive because we have these filters built into our bodies.
Right.
So hopefully that'll help everyone understand a little bit more when you use the term objective universe as to what we're talking about. Is that's what is out there, not just what we can perceive of it.
Well, it might be easier if they think of it in terms of mind and matter. Matter is everything outside of us that's material. And, people, materialists and scientists might argue that mind is just an emergent property of matter, or a result of chemicals and electricity in our brain. But Settians don't go by that theory. We think that there is something else going on because for one thing, because of what I just said about our ability to have an impact on the external world. For example, other life forms have to adapt themselves to the environment in order to survive. Human beings are the only life forms that I'm aware of that can adapt the environment to themselves. We can go in underwater, we can go into outer space.
True, very true.
Not only that, but we're also the only animals that have culture. We have art, literature, science, philosophy, history, all this stuff. And each culture, and Sisymus Flowers points this out in his books, Lords of the Left-Hand Path specifically, no two human cultures are the same. They're all different. If you look at how beavers build dams in one part of the world, it's going to be the same somewhere else. They don't have architecture where, like, these beavers' dams over here look different than the ones over here, and the wolf pack social structure would be the same a million years ago or today, no matter where it is on the globe. So there's obviously something funny going on with human beings.
Yeah, in that we evolve and change, hopefully for the better. Sometimes we change for the worse, but animals, even though today they're finding out that there is forms of communication going on in the animal world, it's still not anywhere near at the level of human communication and the transference of information. There's no real teaching other than how to kill your food and eat it by the animals, or eat this plant, not this plant, sort of thing. It's very simplistic and rudimentary. Whereas, even you go back to the things that Pythagoras wrote. While sometimes he got a few things wrong because he didn't have the knowledge at the time, there's still a lot of it that holds up today. And the same thing with Aristotle and Socrates. We can understand what they were talking about back then and apply it to what we use today.
Right. Well, and even the parts of it where they're mistaken, you can still read it and see how yes, this makes sense. He was wrong in a couple of areas here, and then a lot of it though is still very much applicable, because a lot of what they were doing, they were more interested in what it was to be human and to live life as a human, more so than what they weren't so much interested. They were interested in nature and in the objective universe, but they seemed to be more interested in the self and in the soul and the human mind. What is it that we're supposed to do while we're here? And that is very much tied up with, as I said, Mysterion. Socrates claimed that he was wise because he was self-aware, in the sense of aware of his own ignorance. In order to seek wisdom, you have to assume that you don't already possess it, or that you can't have preconceived notions about what you're going to find out, which is what happened when Christians and other different types of thinkers started trying to use philosophy. They would use philosophy to try to reinforce their beliefs, or they would already have these preconceived notions or these pre-established thoughts that they would then, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, tried to use Aristotelian logic to prove the existence of God. He already had in mind ahead of time that God already exists. There's no question about that. The question is, how do I prove it or convince other people in an intellectual way? And faith and reason are completely at odds with each other. So that's like trying to mix oil and water.
Oh, yeah.
When I say faith, my definition of faith is believing something without evidence or in spite of evidence to the contrary. I know that it also has a connotation of a faith, as in a religion, but when I use it, I'm using it in that sense.
Right. And I mean, really, for us, the opposite of faith would be knowledge and understanding.
Right.
We know it exists. We don't just believe it exists, and it's really one of those things that people get kind of hung up when people, because people in the temple even sometimes have used the term faith, or I believe, but in most cases they're not using it as I believe or I have faith in this, but I have knowledge and understanding. Because really, one of the interesting parts of the temple that I believe I talked about in the first episode was that it really, while the Temple of Set is a religion, it doesn't get to be a religion until you achieve the degree of the priesthood, because at that point you have to have knowledge and understanding of the existence of Set. Before that, you can be into whatever you want out of the black magic, whatever you want to get out of it. Philosophy perhaps.
Right.
And, but you're really there to learn more about yourself. And I would say actually in many ways, a lot of what the people do as first and second degrees probably comes from a philosophical standpoint. Is, they have to develop an understanding of themselves in order to change themselves. They have to know what they have, what they don't have, and how they can get, or whether or not they need to get that they don't have.
Well, yes, the whole point of philosophy is that you start with what is obvious or self-evident. That being, it's obvious that I exist because I'm thinking and communicating with others. It's obvious there's an external world or universe that exists because things happen to me that I don't necessarily, appreciate or plan for. Mm-hmm. Like having a flat tire today. And you have to start with that. Now those existence is axiomatic. You can't proceed any further without existence, consciousness, mind and matter. Those two things are your basic starting point. However, they are mysterious. You know that they are, but you don't know what they are in the sense of all the details and what all the implications of that are and what is to be done. So that is why that's the whole reason you start on this quest. That's the whole reason people end up in the temple, is because of philosophy. Although they might not have be consciously aware of it, we seek the temple out without, we don't know it's the temple yet, and people can end up in other places too. I'm just using us as an example because we're Setians and this is what we're talking about.
Right.
But we end up here because we have these questions. What's the nature of the universe? What's my nature? What am I supposed to do? That's why we're here. We wouldn't have gotten here if we weren't curious, as Dr. Aquino said in his interview, if we weren't curious about what all this is. That's the whole drive of the mystery, is that it agitates us or provokes us. If we're elect, then it provokes us to wake up and to begin this kind of quest or questioning or seeking. Or I guess the predominant response is you get agitated and then you try to insulate yourself from that so you can be comfortable or go back to sleep or whatever.
Right. And now, would you suggest, because I certainly feel this way, is that, even philosophical ideas that you don't believe in, you shouldn't cut them out. You should learn about them just so you can try and understand why the person's doing this. Like when you were talking about Thomas Aquinas,
right?
To him, God existed. Now he was just trying to pull stuff together it's like, I have the answer. Now I'm going to make up the equation.
Right.
And, I think it's good to look at what other people think about, what makes them who they are. I mean, I was raised, my mother was actually raised as a Catholic, and she had enough of it. So she basically just exposed me to many different religions. I mean, we have a Catholic side of our family, so when someone gets married, it's almost always a Catholic wedding ceremony, which, I try hard not to fall asleep during. But we've also had friends who are Jewish, and I've been to some of their services, and my mother also has an interest in Native American lore. So, I've been to some of theirs as well. And, it's not for me, but I can understand why those people, why it works for them, and I mean, I'm not going to say anything bad about someone because they're Catholic. And that's usually one of the things that frightens people the most, is like, what do you mean? You don't hate me because I'm a Christian? And it's like, no, I really could care less. I'm happy. I'm happy you found something that works for you. It just doesn't work for me. So, because I mean, we want to practice what we want. So, why shouldn't we let them practice what they want? And, there's no reason to get into battles with them, because the intellectual battles really just end up wasting time, basically. It's like trying to teach a pig to sing. It only annoys the pig, and it doesn't get any music out of it.
Yeah, well, for the most part, I agree with what you're saying. I think one reason they react that way is because it's so much in their mindset that they are supposed to try to go out and witness or preach or try to convert others, so that when they encounter people to whose mindset that type of thinking is alien, they're not used to that, because that's so much how they operate. So there is some value in looking at ideas of monotheists, what we define as right-hand path in the temple, to distinguish it from our left-hand path orientation. That being, left-hand path is self-oriented, and when I say self, I don't mean our mundane personality, because the whole point of initiation is that like I said, the universe and ourselves, those are mysteries. So we don't know ourselves when we first start, which is what the self-orientation means. We want to find out our true nature, because when we're born, we have teachers, preachers, parents, politicians, advertising, all this stuff we're bombarded with and basically socialized and indoctrinated from birth. That basically makes up our personality. So most of what people think they are before they start an initiatory path is basically stuff that other people implanted in them and made them identify themselves with. That's why people get so defensive when you do intellectually criticize ideas that, like religious or philosophical ideas, because they haven't discovered their true nature. They get very defensive, because to them that is their self.
Right.
And so it is good to look at these other types of ideas and examine them in a very critical way. You could even say in a satanic way, not because you have a preconceived notion and you're setting out to undermine or disprove it's not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. You're trying to gain a deeper insight into reality than what's readily apparent. So you're assuming that what is readily apparent is most likely the most superficial or the most ephemeral perception of reality that there is. And that's the reason for example, looking into the philosophical ideas or religious ideas of what we would call right-hand path, just to find out why is this appealing to people? What are the basic ideas upon which it rests, and why does it? Obviously, it's has some kind of appeal and serves some kind of function or purpose, or it wouldn't exist. And I think I agree with you. I don't think that what we do and the left-hand path is for the many, it is for the few. But, and I'm perfectly willing to be tolerant and let people do what they do and be what they want to be. But where it crosses the line with some of these right-hand path religions is because it is so much their agenda to go out and convert or conquer that it becomes dangerous, because they then cross the line, like the Muslims that flew the planes into the World Trade Center, for example. And I think that, and this is once again where philosophy is very important, what ideas a person has in their mind does have a direct influence on their behavior, which has an impact in the objective universe, and that's a perfect example of it. And also all of the crusades during the Middle Ages, the witch burnings. I think that if our founding fathers hadn't left England once again for religious intolerance, and they hadn't formulated our government the way they did as far as separation of church and state and so forth, I think Christians would still be doing a lot of the same things they used to do back then if they were allowed to.
Yeah, and I think, one of the key things with the left-hand path, someone I was talking with one day said to me, "Why are you always asking why?" And I said, because I have to. I'm not going to just accept what someone says, and I have to find out for myself. And, there I am bringing up self again. And whereas people on the left-hand path, it's the belief, it's the faith, not the knowledge and understanding that you have on the left-hand path. And,
Right.
I'm sure there are several Christian priests that might contact me and say, but I have knowledge and understanding of what God is. And it's like, I'm going to have to respond to them with, okay, fine, tell me. And if all they can say is, well, you wouldn't be able to understand it because you don't have the background I do. And I'm like, well, why can't you explain it? I mean, Dr. Aquino explains Set very easily. And, I think there's a lot of people out there. I mean, I've been receiving emails from people who are not in the Temple of Set, and they have no intention of joining the Temple of Set, but still, they were able to understand more about what we do and how we do it and why we do it from that. And, it's the question of asking why that's, to me, the heart of the left-hand path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, right, because if you can at least try to explain it to somebody, they might not have the intellectual capacity to understand, but if you at least explain something, they can then decide whether or not it makes sense to them or not, or if they can't understand it, they just can't understand it. I don't care how many times I try to read a book on calculus, I'm not going to understand that.
Yeah.
So it's, in that sense, I just have to accept that that's not something for me, which is once again a very left-hand path concept. Is not only are we interested in evolving ourselves to a divine level, but we also have to, in self-awareness, we have to become aware of our limitations in addition to becoming aware of our strengths, and we work to emphasize our strengths and to remain aware of, but make it to where our limitations or weaknesses don't hinder us from that evolution or that Kepher.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why we're all different in the Temple of Set. We all have different interests and different practices that we do.
Yeah, and there is a huge diversification of processes that people use in order to Kepher within the organization. I think philosophy tends to leak out into some of the others, whether or not they realize it or not. It's something that a lot of Setians use just because, they like to have the understanding. They want the wisdom. And, they are just looking for it regarding, say, runic interests or vampiric interests, that they have for changing themselves. And I think really philosophy is one of the cornerstones that, whether or not everyone in the temple realizes it, it's something that they're all using in one form or another.
Absolutely. It underpins everything we do, so that with what I have done in my work, there's that aspect of philosophy, but then my specific focus that is not something that everyone in the temple has to focus on, or it's not necessarily a part of what everyone in the temple does, is I specifically focus on the Hellenic and Hellenistic traditions of philosophy and magic, which obviously Pythagoras came up with the word philosophy, but as Dr. Aquino pointed out about the word Kepher, that's not something he had a corner on in the market of ideas or whatever. Like you say, it's everywhere. He was just a person who explicitly identified and brought more of a focus and an awareness as to just what that is. Like you said, it's everybody who is seeking any kind of wisdom, even non-Setians, is doing philosophy in a sense. And that's another thing. I think when I hear the word philosophy, I tend to think of it more in that way, as a mode of doing something or a discipline. I know most people they'll say like, well, that's his philosophy. They think of it like as a noun or as somebody's worldview, how their subjective universe is configured or whatever. And I think that's a secondary and less important, although not necessarily an invalid use of the word. I think this other sense in which it is a quest for wisdom is more important than that sense of the word.
Right. Well, you know, it's kind of funny. This reminded me of something that kind of started me on the path where I am now. And this was many years ago when I was in college. There was a friend of mine who was a Mormon. And I said to him, Ed, you guys, don't you go like door to door and like try and convert people? And he said, well, there are two kinds of people in our eyes. They're lambs and they're goats. You're a goat. And I just smiled and I said, thank you. Because, now whenever a Mormon rings my doorbell, I open the door and I say, I'm a goat. I'm sorry, I can't help you. And, here was someone, he recognized, he knew it's not even worth it for him to bother with me. And, he saw something in me that I appreciated, but I didn't really understand it at the time until, I ended up joining the Temple of Set. And so, we sometimes have used the word sheeple for people who just, want to follow the flock. And so the fact that the Mormons were using lambs and goats, is kind of a telling thing as well, I think.
Well, if you think about it, the mysterion, that mystery or that runa, has one of two effects on people. It's much like the law of the trapezoid. It either has a disruptive effect on both types of people, but what you're referring to as the goats, that disruptive influence is stimulating to them, and that then starts them on that, as you said, why this, why that, and how do things work? And I want to find out what's over there. So then you start moving from here to there, and which then ties into other eonic or teleological concepts like Kepher, remanifest, etc. And to the sheep type of person, though, the unknown or the mysterious in them is what causes fear, intolerance, ignorance, and eventually leads to the types of acts of violence against others who do not want to just accept or just conform or just be comfortable or whatever.
Yeah, and you mentioned 9/11 earlier, and one of the things that kind of dropped my jaw about that, of course the event was horrific and everything, but one of the craziest things to me is one of the guys who was who piloted one of the jets wrote in a note before he left that after he accomplished his task, he wanted to be buried on his side facing Mecca. And I was like thinking, he's crashing a plane into a building. Do you think there's even any part of him they're going to find? I mean, as far as I know, I don't think they found any bits and pieces of the people who, committed this crime. So to think that, they're going to crash the plane and their body's going to stay intact, that shows some faulty logic there. And
well, yes, that shows you how rational his thought process was. Which I'm glad you said that, because that brings up another important point. A lot of people who get into occultism or magic or what we might call New Age alternative spiritualities or pursuits, to those who end up in the Temple of Set, it's very important that, yes, we are into darker, more intuitive, or what you might want to call more subconscious activities in ritual, magic, meditation, dream work, and so forth. But because this is so dangerous, we also explicitly emphasize rationality and reason. It's very important. We have the Setian Academy, which Setians can go to learn logic and grammar and rhetoric, which sadly are not taught in our public education system anymore. It's geared, our education is now geared to channel people into their niche in society, and not so much to teach critical thinking or logic or questioning, because it's easier to get people's votes if you can appeal to their emotions rather than having to appeal to logic or reason. So they deliberately try to dumb down the population that way, which is why people are less and less well educated.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Well, Doug, if you could sort of encapsulate now, why philosophy works for you, because I don't want to run too long with the show today, but, your final thoughts on why some of the listeners should look into more about philosophy.
Well, why they should pursue philosophy is it's empowering. It empowers you. If you don't answer these questions for yourself, somebody else is going to answer them for you. And perhaps why they should maybe look into studying some philosophy in addition to their more arcane or magical interests. Maybe go back and maybe get a copy of Aristotle's work, The Organon, which is his work on logic, and join the Setian Academy and learn how to think critically and logically. And I think it will, as we say in our literature, the black arts are very dangerous, and they're very dangerous because we're exploring aspects of ourselves that most people bury in their unconscious, and that's why it's dark, because what's in the unconscious is not in the light of consciousness. So I think philosophy helps us do this without quite so much danger. It helps ground us, and it helps keep us focused in a direction that is fruitful and beneficial rather than self-destructive. It gives direction. You need the rational part for focus and direction.
Good. All right. Well, Doug, thank you for being on the show today. And, I hope we reach a lot of listeners and that they find some change that they can bring about in themselves because of this.
I hope so too. That's my goal.
You've been listening to KHPR, The Voice of Darkness. If you have any questions or comments, you can email them to us at khpr@kepher.org. Thank you for listening, and we hope that we've been able to bring about some change for you.